Thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here. It's a bit grayer than I thought, but we were at the G20 Energy Transitions Working Group in Buenos Aires, where it is legitimately summer and is legitimately hot. And we were looking at the temperatures, and it was warmer here than there. And so anyway, I don't have enough warm clothes for today, but thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here, and I want to congratulate everybody involved in this initiative, everybody at Duke. I want to raise my hat to Jim and his leadership, and I think it's important to have as much brain power as we can muster focused on what is a truly solvable issue. I mean, if we can't do something about this at this point in our evolution as a species, then there's really something quite wrong. And I think that there's been a lot of new thinking and new galvanised action within the academy, just here on the East Coast, and I think that we have an opportunity for collaborative work across many, many different pieces of the academy, places of the academy, and I look forward to seeing the results of this work in supporting the people in this room who are at the pointy end of the business to go further, faster. So I've just come from the Energy Transitions Working Group, which was underwhelming in its sense of urgency, underwhelming by their sense of what is possible. And I think more frightening even than those two was underwhelming in the sense that the people who sit there and negotiate this stuff have of what is actually happening in the market, what is happening in innovation, what is actually happening and what is possible within finance, and what the true definition of the issue really is. And, you know, at one level, you could wonder whether that really matters. I mean, is that a problem for the G20, or is that a problem for us? I think it is slightly a problem for us. This is a challenge. Universal access is something that everybody said that they would commit to. They did commit to in 2015. It's something that has to be done by 2030. We put a time limit on it. We didn't say 2100 or whenever or Tuesday week. You know, we said 2030. So we've got 12 years to go. And we've got more and more definition around that. We know more and more about what that means. And we see more and more sort of forces clustering at the edge of the battlefield, as it were. But I mean, I'm not sure that we're yet organised enough to be able to put ourselves on a path of appropriate speed and scale. So I just want to talk about a few of the challenges that I see, challenges where I think Duke can probably help together with many others, and challenges perhaps which are just contextual for the work that Duke and others will do. First of all, data. I don't like talking about data, but I have to. This field has been blessed, actually, by extraordinary collaboration over the last 6 to 8 years of all of the people who generate data that could shine a light on this problem. And there is still much to be done. For example, most of the data is not gender disaggregated, and we need to find the resources to spur the World Bank to disaggregate that data, in particular the household survey data that we use to validate other people's data, that actually when somebody says that that village is connected, that actually we can do a household survey to understand that actually the people in the houses in the village are actually using the electrons or are actually accessing the clean fuels. So within the SDGs, the UN also embraced household survey data as an important and essential part of understanding whether or not the goals had been achieved. So while I welcome within international institutions the excitement now around access that wasn't there 2 to 3 years ago, and more people coming out now with reports on access, unless that is validated by the household survey data, then it's just the government minister's word against somebody else's, which does not help. In fact, it detracts. And so we need to have complete transparency around the assumptions in data sets, and we need to continue to work together as an international community around data sets which are truly meaningful and which are validated at the household level. And we need to put more resources into that if that is difficult, because honey rather than vinegar will bring everybody around the pot. So I see that as a role for SE for All, but I think that there are big gaps in the data, and I see huge opportunities for the Academy and potentially for Duke to help in propelling some of the things that we don't know forward. Second is dialogue. In many developed countries, we take for granted the ability for entrepreneurs to sit down with policymakers at the local level, at the national level, to talk about what is and isn't happening or what would and would not be desirable. This lack of public policy dialogue in the energy sector has plagued, I think, the ability of decision makers to be able to see the way forward in the recent past. So for most ministers and for most policymakers within ministries, it's still difficult for them to truly understand and embrace the extent to which decentralized energy solutions alongside their centralized energy solutions will be a bigger part of the solution than perhaps they think, that could produce results perhaps more quickly than they think, and may produce results more cheaply than they think. The vast majority of the advice going in still is about centralized power, about gigawatts and billions of dollars, about distribution and transmission. And then there's a little bit of advice that's going in alongside, which is about this other piece of the problem, which is totally disjointed, which is over here. And the big guys can get through the door. So the utilities in Europe, who now want to be putting their toes in or their feet into the off-grid space, they can get through the door. But it's very difficult for the small guys in that space to get through the door in a meaningful way. And it's very difficult to create the platform for the big guys and the little guys who actually have very much of a shared analysis about what is and isn't working into a room in a way in which ministers can hear. There have been attempts, Kenya has had a round table, there are other countries across sub-Saharan Africa where there are attempts at a sustained policy dialogue that will help countries plan in an integrated way. But that's still there's still much to be done. Third is evolution of the ecosystem. I would dread that this problem suffers from some of the other development problems of our day where they become development problems, which means that they then become solutions for development finance. Or so the expectation is that they will be solved by development finance. We have a number of extraordinary innovations in business model, in financial models, in business ideas, in ways of thinking about the problem, all working, some better than others, some growing faster than others, across the countries where the energy access gap is the largest, across India, across the rest of South Asia, across East Africa in particular, but now with West Africa really picking up the pace. But this is an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem that has to be populated by more than just 5 charismatic species. Right? We need dung beetles as well as rhinos. And we have to be good enough as an international community when creating markets to be able to put enough finance at risk that all of that stuff gets built as well. There is room for people to sink technical assistance into this field because it will be to the benefit of many, many, many different companies that come along, some of which won't survive, some of which won't grow, some of which will fold, some of which will get bought. That's fine. We're building an ecosystem. But the tendency is to pick the technology too quickly, decide that we're going to make a bet on one thing and not another. The tendency is to put too many bells and whistles around the quality of finance too early. And the tendency is to slice and dice that ecosystem to the point where no species will be able to really truly roam within its range. And so let's not think of this as a development problem. There are development issues within the need to find universal access for energy. But there are all kinds of market creation. There are all kinds of social development planning issues. The bottom of the pyramid shouldn't expect to have their energy services met by the private sector. We don't expect that in most developed countries. Their needs will be met by innovations in social safety net provisions and other public instruments alongside private management of services. And so we will need to think of this as an economic development and market creation and market development issue that has development specifics to it if we are going to build something quick enough and wide enough to serve everybody's needs. The fourth then is running on from that. In 2015, when we agreed the SDGs and we agreed the Paris Climate Agreement, we also agreed something called the Addis Ababa Agenda on Development Finance. The Addis Ababa Agenda on Development Finance said, first of all, stop capital flight. Second, stop corruption and illicit flows of finance. Thirdly, increase and improve tax systems and increase the tax take, and then use the tax take for the things that are needed within the SDGs. Fifth, we came to international capital flows, and then, way down the list you get to development finance and climate finance. In many of the countries where the access gap is the largest, the amount of domestic investment in energy services is less than 2% of GDP. The conversation about how to invest domestically is very important, as is the conversation about how to indigenize the finance and the capital that's going into the off-grid space. This is very much at the moment overseas money coming in to African markets. The education of Nigerian and Kenyan banks, beyond one bank in Kenya that we know is taking risk, to really become participants in what is going to be a substantial market domestically. And for those who actually start manufacturing in Ethiopia, or for some of those in Kenya that have mastered one or two pieces of the market, there is a potential export market across the continent, which is huge. So the education of the domestic banking sector, so that it feels that it understands this and can be a true participant and drive this market forward, will be very important for its secure long-term growth. The fifth question really is the institutions of the future. In no country in the world do we have the energy institutions, utilities, regulators, rural electrification agencies for what the world will look like in 10 years' time. In some parts of the world, people are sort of transforming themselves from what they used to be to what they think they need to be. In some parts of the world, new institutions are being set up, but many of them perhaps with a foot back in the past rather than fully in the future. But if we think about the future energy services being delivered, and if we think about closing the access gap, and we think about the role that digitalisation and decentralisation are going to be playing, and the fact that this is going to be met with decarbonised solutions no matter what the World Coal Association says, then the institutions that we need are going to be very different from the ones we have today. And in fact, many people will get their energy services not from the electricity or the energy sector per se. They're going to get it bundled from other places. They're going to get their energy with something else that they are accessing. And so how we think about that and what the disruptive opportunity is for the developing countries for this problem is foremost is something that I think there's not enough work going on, not enough thinking going on. The fifth question is maybe one that you don't want to work on, but maybe you should, which is how to stop people falling back into energy poverty in countries where growth and development is either stymied by austerity or where the levels of inequality within the economy are condemning parts of the population to lack of access. So in this country, it would be the reservations, the Northwest, and elsewhere in the United States, it would be communities of colour in some parts of the country where they are ill-served, or it will be where price points for energy become unobtainable living on low income. In the United Kingdom, it's in the social housing estates and in the immigrant communities within those social housing estates where the affordability of electricity has now become something which is problematic. So there's a lot more to be done in the developed world as well. These are universal SDGs. The final point I want to make is about those who are at the bottom of the pyramid. There's a big female face on the 1 billion people who don't have access to electricity. There's an even bigger female face on the 3 billion people who don't have access to clean fuels for cooking. Within those communities, there are the disabled, there are the marginalised by ethnicity, marginalised by rural location. There are those for whom, you know, a profit-making model is probably never going to be the way that we think about it. But in the brouhaha around blended finance, we really do think that we can bring solutions that we've never scaled to the most remote community very quickly. There is going to be a need for bundling energy services with other services that have to be provided to the marginalised poor living within the slums or informal settlements of South Asia, or to the remotest rural community within the Sahel. And what is the way in which we're going to do that? And how do we use the development finance that is supposed to be used for that while we use other forms of finance for other parts of the world? I do believe that there is an incredible community of new finance that is interested in being part of the solution to this problem. I think it has to be tapped. I think it has to be tapped in good old-fashioned ways as well as new ones. So I think there's plenty of room for equity participation, and there's plenty of room for blending and all the rest of it. And there's a desperate need for good old-fashioned technical assistance. There's a desperate need for good old-fashioned working capital and long-term debt and really patient capital, by which I don't mean 3 to 5 years. And if we can stitch together new entrants into this exciting moment where we know that technologically we can close the access gap, and we know that in terms of business models that there is enough innovative people out there to be able to solve the problems as they appear, and when we know more and more about who the 1 billion are and who the 3 billion are, then I do think that with discipline and with focus we stand a chance of truly closing this goal. The final thing I want to say is about communication. The energy sector goes after this question as an energy issue. It's an energy issue, but it's not really. What people want is clean air for their kids. What people want is to be able to cook a meal affordably and not choke in the process. What people want is to be able to go to the clinic and know that the clinic will be open that day because there's electricity. What people want is for their kid not to be freezing cold at lunchtime in school and therefore not remember anything that they learnt that morning. And that's the way we have to that's the way we have to sell energy access as an issue that deserves to sort of peek its head above the parapet of all the other issues that have to be addressed. We, together with many others in this room, are working on making the economic case for attacking energy access early. So if you could achieve energy access, productive use of access in the next 4 years as opposed to the next 14, what would you achieve in that 10-year period that you aren't accounting for? So the savings to the household level, the hours of school time gained, potential health benefits gained. And I think in that way, you turn the head of the policymaker. In that way, you turn the head of the decision maker. In that way, you turn the head of the elected leader. But it's good to have Duke on board. This is a solvable problem. Some of the SDGs are a little bit more amorphous, you know, the rule of law. How you know when you've got the rule of law or not, I don't know. We thought we had it here until very recently. This is something that's measurable. This is something that's achievable, and you're all very welcome to the struggle. Thank you very much.